Hello, and welcome to the pinnacle of modernity, where individual freedoms and transparency flourished, 1970s Iran. As you've seen in those nostalgic photos, women twirled freely in the streets, and men raised their glasses high at dazzling parties, celebrating life with carefree joy. And hold on tight, because we're in the very heart of science and technology. Mini-skirted women scientists aren't just writing computer code. They're making groundbreaking discoveries in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Meanwhile, muscular shirtless men are pushing the boundaries of space exploration, so much so that they're planning human missions to Mars and cutting NASA out of the game, building their very own space stations. But then, enter the Islamic Revolution, wiping it all away. Of course, what I just said is complete bullshit. Yet, I see this pre-revolution Iran propaganda all over social media, and it's becoming exhausting. That's why I wanted to start this video with a little sarcasm before diving into the real story behind Iran's road to revolution. Simplistic and surface-level narratives like these do more harm than good. By glossing over the complexities of history, they not only prevent us from learning valuable lessons, but also mislead and distort our understanding. Yes, there was a certain degree of freedom and prosperity in Iran before the revolution. But the real question is, who exactly enjoyed that freedom, and at what cost? The answer isn't simple. Reducing everything to a neat summary would miss the nuance and complexity of the time. Beneath the modern surface lay deep social injustices and widespread problems. Welcome to a detailed journey through the events that shaped Iran into the country we know today. Let's get started. The streets of Iran were flooded with people. Chaos was everywhere. This was a powerful movement, seen as ruthless, corrupt, and illegitimate in the eyes of the people rising against the regime. Students in particular felt humiliated by the Shah and his government, determined to overthrow what they saw as a suffocating dictatorship. To them, there was no true freedom in the country. With the support of the people, revolutionary forces led by Ayatollah Khomeini forced the Shah into exile. His government was toppled, and a new Islamic regime took its place. The people of Iran had chosen Khomeini, wanting him as their leader. Never before had the world seen a popular revolution quite like this. The Islamic Revolution would set Iran on a new path, one that would lead to war with its neighbor and ongoing conflict with the West, while simultaneously reshaping the country into an independent and defiant nation. But to fully understand how things got here, we need to go further back. When World War I broke out, Iran declared its neutrality. Despite this, the country quickly became affected by the pre-war rivalry between the Entente and Central Powers. European interests in Iran were primarily tied to its strategic location between British India, Russia, Afghanistan, and the Ottoman Empire, as well as its oil reserves, first discovered on May 26, 1908. In the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907, Russia and Britain agreed to divide Iran into 3 zones. The Russians claimed northern Iran, neighboring the territories they had previously conquered in the Caucasus, while the British claimed the southern part, bordering British India. This agreement effectively ended the decades-long Great Game between Russia and Britain. However, the Soviet Revolution changed these plans. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russians withdrew from Iran, leaving the country to British influence. In 1919, Britain pressured the weak Iranian government into signing a treaty that aimed to place Iran fully under British control. But before the treaty could be implemented, a coup took place in Iran. The Qajar dynasty, which had ruled for 130 years, ended when the Shah fled to Europe. In his place, Reza Pahlavi, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, declared himself Shah, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Pahlavi claimed that he originally wanted to establish a republic. However, fearing that a democratic Iran might fall under Soviet influence, the British pressured him to become Shah instead. Reza Pahlavi's greatest passion was modernization. He openly admired Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Turkey's president, and wanted to replicate in Iran what Ataturk had achieved in Turkey. However, unlike the relatively moderate modernization process in Turkey, Reza Pahlavi sought rapid progress and chose to enforce it through state repression. One of his methods was to impose a strict ban on headscarves even in public. He also forbade veiled women from entering government offices, shops, hospitals, and even bathhouses across the country, leaving many women confined to their homes. Naturally, devout Shiites protested these policies, but in response, the Shah became even more despotic. In 1928, after a protest in the holy city of Qom, he stormed the city, entered a mosque wearing his boots, and punched the clerics inside. In 1935, after a demonstration in the city of Mashhad, the Shah's soldiers were ordered to open fire on the crowd. He executed dozens of religious leaders. However, this secular violence triggered the rise of Islamist violence. It was during this period that the foundation for radical Islamist movements, which would leave a lasting mark on the century, was laid. In the 1940s, the Fada'iyan-e-Islam, devotees of Islam, considered the first modern Islamic terrorist organization, emerged. By 1941, the British, having lost faith in Reza Shah, decided to remove him from power. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who declared himself the King of Kings, came to power in 1941 after his father was deposed following the joint British-Soviet occupation of Iran during World War II. Throughout the war, Iran remained under the control of British and Soviet forces. The northern half of the country was occupied by Soviet troops, while the British held the south, claiming to defend the region from potential threats. Iran also served as a crucial supply route for American and British aid to the Soviet Union. According to their agreement, both Britain and the Soviet Union were supposed to gradually withdraw from Iran after the war. However, when the time came, neither side was eager to leave. The Soviets, in particular, sought to establish a satellite state in Iran's northern territories, forming connections with Kurdish groups and eventually founding the short-lived Mahabad Republic in 1946. In response, the British turned to the United States for support. In March 1946, the Iranian government formally lodged a complaint against the Soviet Union at the United Nations, while both Britain and the US issued diplomatic notes to the Soviets. Finally, after intense pressure, an agreement was reached in April 1946. Soviet troops would withdraw, and in return, a joint Iranian-Soviet oil company would be established, and internal conflicts would be resolved peacefully. By May 9, 1946, Soviet forces had completely left Iran. When Mohammad Reza Shah took power, there was hope that he would be more tolerant and offer greater freedoms. But that wasn't the case. Shah's close ties with foreign powers, especially the West, made Iranians question the Shah's legitimacy. The monarchy was seen as dependent on imperial forces. For the nationalists, the only way to assert real authority over Iran was to break free from the monarchy. The country's most valuable natural resource, oil, was in the hands of the British. These rights were acquired at the start of the 20th century for a fraction of their true value. Initially, British companies received various concessions in Iran, such as exploration rights along the Karun River, support for carpet-weaving workshops, and the construction of telegraph lines. But the most significant privilege was the right to search for oil in southwestern Iran. In 1901, an Englishman named William Knox Darcy was granted a 60-year concession to explore for oil in Iran, a deal that became known as the Darcy Agreement. Under this contract, 16% of the profits went to Iran, while 84% went to the British company. In 1908, oil was discovered in the city of Masjid Soliman. The following year, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was founded, and by 1912, oil from Masjid Soliman was being transported to the Gulf. Seeking greater control, the British government acquired over 50% of the company's shares in 1914, giving them formal authority over Iran's oil. Despite all this, Iran was excluded from the wealth its own resources generated. When the global economic crisis hit in 1929, the British further reduced payments to Iran, citing financial difficulties. By November 1932, Iran had had enough and declared the cancellation of the oil concessions. Although negotiations between the two countries continued, the British ultimately imposed a new agreement that Iran begrudgingly accepted. Meanwhile, the country was filled with resentment, particularly towards the many British workers employed by the oil companies. In Abadan, where many of the oil fields were located, the Iranian workers lived in poverty, while the British enjoyed a life of luxury. The stark contrast between the opulent lifestyles of the British and the suffering of the Iranian people became a growing source of frustration, fueling anger that would later contribute to the revolution. In 1951, the Shah of Iran appointed Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister after his National Front Party secured a parliamentary majority. One of Mossadegh's first actions was the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum. This move immediately caused a crisis in relations between Iran and the United Kingdom. Arguing that the nationalization violated existing agreements, the British took the case to an international court. Mossadegh successfully defended Iran's position, securing international approval for the nationalization of its oil industry. Mossadegh's nationalist approach, along with his push to eliminate British control over Iran's oil, alarmed both the British and the Americans, who feared that Mossadegh's policies could draw Iran closer to the Soviet Union. This concern led the British and American governments to collaborate on a plan to remove Mossadegh from power. The coup operation, led by MI6 officer Norman Derbyshire and CIA, revealed the extensive efforts by British intelligence to convince the United States to cooperate. This involved recruiting agents over several years and bribing Iranian parliament members with money hidden in biscuit tins. Even the Shah's sister was involved, tasked with persuading the reluctant Shah to endorse the coup. Derbyshire, who oversaw the operation from Cyprus, proudly boasted about keeping the costs low. According to him, the coup against Mossadegh cost Britain £700,000. However, it appears that in the long run this was a poorly calculated expense. The 1953 coup firmly reinstated the Shah's power, while Mossadegh spent his remaining days under house arrest at his family home. The once revered political hero of modern Iran was silenced, and any discourse about the former leader was also suppressed. Later, the Shah would dramatically declare to Roosevelt, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." The Shah's mistake was not making decisions himself. Instead, these were made by foreign advisors, particularly Americans, who played a key role in planning things for the Shah. Critics argued that he seemed more interested in developing an extravagant lifestyle than in governing the country. The Pahlavis were often photographed alongside some of the most influential people in the world and frequently hosted lavish wealth parties. The Shah's tales of womanizing were always in the world press. In 1963, the Shah announced an ambitious modernization program, known as the White Revolution. The program included plans for land redistribution, as well as comprehensive social reforms. For the first time, women would be allowed to vote. The lifelong admirer of Western culture, the Shah seemed to impose Western ideals on Iran. He claimed that his reforms had advanced his country beyond that of some Scandinavian nations. However, the land reform angered landowners, the wealthy clergy and the peasant farmers who received the land. This was because the land was not redistributed, it was sold. Uncultivated, barren lands were sold to poor farmers, who were required to pay in installments over 15 years. Many were deprived of a means of livelihood, left their villages, and lost their way of life. While social reforms began to change the country's landscape, the voices of criticism against these reforms began to rise. A particular religious leader stood out. He stated that the only thing white about the White Revolution was the influence of the White House. According to him, these reforms increased Western influence in Iran and undermined Shia values. The name of that religious leader was Ayatollah Khomeini. As reforms continued, the Shah also maintained his closeness to America. A new agreement was made that granted certain privileges to the American army in Iran. This situation led Khomeini to criticize the Shah as being submissive to Western imperialism. Khomeini's criticism of the reforms in the Shah was harsh and uncompromising, just as the Shah's response was. Khomeini's arrest and imprisonment led to protests in the holy city of Qom, where he was located. The Shah approved the use of military force to suppress the protests. However, the Iranian people did not relent in their protests against the arrest of Khomeini, an important cleric in the country. As a gesture of respect, the Shah pardoned Khomeini and sent him into exile in Iraq. The Shah, who at least temporarily sidelined Ayatollah Khomeini, turned his attention to Iran's leftist opposition. During a period when the Cold War was at its peak and the Soviet Union was Iran's most powerful neighbor, the Shah was determined to halt the rising popularity of communism and socialism. He organized rallies in Iran to warn the public about this threat and deployed SAVAK to suppress this danger. SAVAK, Iran's internal security service, was established in 1957 with the assistance of Mossad and the CIA. Widespread arrests, torture, and execution methods quickly created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation among the Iranian people. According to human rights groups, approximately 1,000 political dissidents were executed during the Shah's reign, and 4,500 were imprisoned. The methods of SAVAK contributed to an increase in opposition to the Shah's regime. He was increasingly seen as a dictator with little tolerance for dissent. However, the Shah believed that his ambitious economic development plans would allow criticism regarding the suppression of political freedom to be ignored. He hoped that oil revenues would support this development and lead to greater prosperity. The ultimate goal was to build an Iran that could be compared to the Japan of that time. He often stated, "We must be the financial center of the world between Japan and Europe. We could be the leading economy in the world." He was determined to spare no expense in pursuing this dream. In just 1 year, in 1974, the Shah spent $16 billion on a development plan aimed at modernizing the country's infrastructure and renewing its military. He took an active role in OPEC to finance his development goals and insisted on increasing oil prices. This insistence led to a rift with his former supporters in Washington. As oil revenues increased, the Shah's confidence grew as well. He was now the Emperor of Oil in 1974, and he made a very radical move. He led a 14% increase in oil prices, which paralyzed Western economies. He insisted that this was in Iran's national interest. It seemed that the Shah was at the peak of his power. However, he wanted to be seen both as a king of oil in the eyes of Western states and as an idealist tolerated for trying to modernize his country as an Easterner. But the global dynamics were much harsher. For the Iranian people, rapid modernization was becoming a national crisis. The suddenly skyrocketing oil prices had enriched the Iranian state too quickly. The Shah thought that if he funneled this money into the domestic economy, it would accelerate development. However, this did not happen. On the contrary, it led to disaster. The country suddenly faced high inflation. Housing prices soared rapidly. Migrants flocked from rural areas to major cities, leading to the formation of slums and a working-class population. Iran's social structure was shattered. The failure to deliver on the promise of prosperity fueled growing anger against the Shah. People from all walks of life were furious about the new economic difficulties and the widespread corruption seen among the Shah's inner circle. Additionally, some of the country's population believed that the Shah was unable to provide the freedoms he had promised. However, the Shah did not appreciate criticism. In 1975, Iran became a one-party state, transitioning to a system that recognized the Shah as the sole leader. This infuriated many in Iran. Subsequently, the Shah accelerated his fight against communism and began collaborating with religious leaders. This was consistent with America's model of cooperating with Islamists in the global fight against communism at that time, which was also being implemented in other countries. The propaganda that equated communism with atheism naturally needed to be spread by religious leaders, and their support was crucial. The Shah followed this policy, believing that they would unite against a common enemy by empowering the clerics. Within Iran, religious leaders were unable to raise their voices significantly due to the harsh suppression of dissenting voices. However, Khomeini, who was in exile in Iraq, could openly criticize the Shah. Exile had granted him the freedom of speech. Thus, Khomeini became the voice of the entire opposition. Since his exile, he maintained his sharp criticisms of the Shah, and his message was disseminated through a vast network of clerics in Iranian mosques. What made Khomeini stand out as the most original was his rejection of the monarchy. He differentiated himself by stating, "No, we do not want to return to a constitutional monarchy. In fact, we want a completely new type of republic, an Islamic republic." Feeling the growing influence of the outspoken cleric, the Shah faced increasing challenges. In response, the Shah began to produce content in the Iranian press that explicitly targeted Khomeini. However, this strategy backfired. Protests began to erupt in Khomeini's city, rapidly spreading across Iran. Most of the protesters didn't share many demands, except for their strong opposition to the Shah. Workers, thousands of state employees, and even striking factory workers only wanted freedom. Iranian intellectuals who called for democracy also joined the protests. In September, martial law was declared in Tehran, and many people lost their lives in clashes between demonstrators and soldiers. After this, things quickly began to deteriorate for the Shah. In a desperate attempt to silence Khomeini, the Shah persuaded then Iraqi Vice President Saddam Hussein to expel Khomeini from the holy city of Najaf, where he was inciting against the Iranian ruler. In October 1978, Khomeini and his entourage took refuge in the small town of Neauphle-le-Château, just outside Paris. The Shah was mistaken if he thought that exiling his enemy would silence him. Khomeini suddenly found himself in Paris, seizing a significant opportunity to promote his movement and influence events unfolding in Iran. In Iran, the Shah began imprisoning all his opponents: workers, clerics, leftists, and libertarians. This led to increasingly loud protests in the streets of Iran. The crowds were no longer just shouting, "The Shah must go." "Death to the Shah" had become a common chant in the streets of Tehran. Nearly every segment of society had united against the Shah's rule. On January 16, 1979, while the streets were engulfed in flames and the regime was in shambles, the Shah fled the country, never to return. Suddenly, the 2,500-year-old Persian monarchy came to an end. The environment was prepared for Ayatollah Khomeini's return after 16 years in exile. 2 weeks after the Shah's departure, Khomeini and his entourage left Paris for Tehran. Journalists asked the Ayatollah how he felt upon returning to Iran, to which he reportedly replied, "Nothing." From December 1978 to December 1979, with the fall of the Shah's regime, there was absolute freedom. Books were being translated and sold by the kilo. People suddenly had access to various works that they could not read before due to censorship. Khomeini quickly appointed Mehdi Bazargan, a pro-democracy activist, as the interim prime minister, expressing hopes that the new government would reflect the wide range of voices united against the Shah. However, for the old guards perceived as enemies of the revolution, revenge was swift and merciless. Many were imprisoned and killed, while others were forced into exile. Hundreds of former government officials and SAVAK agents were executed. There were criticisms from some religious and nationalist groups within the country that the trials and executions were unjust and arbitrary. However, this did not deter the Islamic revolutionaries. With the former supporters of the Shah completely sidelined and the military declaring its neutrality, the Islamic Republic of Iran was officially established on April 1, 1979. All perceived symbols of the West's decline were destroyed, and the Shah's reign came to an end forever. However, his ability to incite opposition did not diminish. After leaving Iran, he sought refuge in many countries and arrived in the US for cancer treatment in October 1979. This visit triggered chaos in Iran and set off a chain of events that would resonate for 30 years. In November 1979, Iranian students and revolutionary groups stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking 66 people hostage. The goal was to bring the former Shah back from America to stand trial in Iran. When the crisis concluded, US President Jimmy Carter was ousted from office, the Islamic Republic of Iran was established, and what was once a close ally, Iran, became a fierce enemy of the United States. Have you noticed that we haven't talked about girls in mini skirts for the last 20 minutes? Now you know why.